So thank you for joining us this morning. We're delighted to be joined by Sarah Buck, who's the Individual Giving and Legacy Manager at Cruise Bereavement Support. Sarah has over 9 years experience in the fundraising, communication and supporter-focused roles. She's currently studying for two diplomas in psychotherapy, working with children and young people. Sarah will be leading us through the session this morning, where she'll be sharing insights, tips and tools to give you the ability to work with bereaved donors, fundraisers and customers confidently and with care. So over to you, Sarah.
Oh, thank you so much. Can I just check that you can see my slides?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for introducing me, Sally, and it's really lovely to be here this morning. As Sally said, I am the Individual Giving and Legacy Manager for Cruise Bereavement Support. I've worked as a fundraiser within the charity and public sector, so I did a short stint with a museum, which was really, really interesting. I always said that I would never work for a health charity. It's just not something that I was interested in. But a friend who had been a volunteer with Cruise and knew that I was looking for a job said, "This job's coming up and I think that you should apply." I think there was just a day left to apply. On the day I was running the Sheffield half, and thankfully I'd taken the day off the next day, put my application in, and within an hour Cruise had called me and said, "We'd like to interview you." And the rest has been history. So I've been with Cruise for nearly 5 years, and last summer I started my current role, and one that I'm really, really enjoying. I'm also a trainee psychotherapist specialising in children and young people, and I'm fascinated by how our childhoods shape who we are, how we relate to others, and also respond to the challenges that come up in our lives. I'm also curious about the things that make us uncomfortable, challenging and difficult for us, not just as fundraisers or whatever our role is, but as actual human beings. And these are some of the things that I will touch on in this presentation. So who has heard of Cruise? We are the UK's leading bereavement charity, reaching thousands of people across the UK each year. We help people through one of the most painful times in life with bereavement support, information and campaigning. Support is provided free in England, Wales and Northern Ireland by over 4,000 highly trained volunteers. Cruise Bereavement Support Scotland provides support in Scotland, and Cruise Bereavement Care Isle of Man provides support on the Isle of Man. We work really closely together as 3 separate organisations, but we do raise funds individually, and services do slightly differ between the 3 different charities. The help and support we offer is not dependent on cause of death or when the death occurred. All bereaved people can access support. We also support families affected by major incidents. We provide support to people grieving in prisons, and we also support military families. I don't know how many of you came along to Dr. John Wilson's webinar in November, but this webinar further explores some of what he spoke about. Grief and bereavement and loss are really big subjects. So my aim today is to give you some insight into the world of grief and tips on working with bereaved supporters, fundraisers and customers confidently and with care. I'm conscious that grief, bereavement and loss are difficult subjects, and if for whatever reason you find this webinar difficult, I won't be offended if you need to take some time for yourself or need to leave. It's okay. Please do take care of yourself, and I hope you find this webinar useful. At Cruise, we know that who died and your connection with them is at the heart of your grief response, along with how they died. But the cause of death doesn't make one bereavement any worse than another. Everyone's response to grief and loss is unique to them. It's not a competitive sport, and we shouldn't compare the feelings people have with our own or others. Every bereavement is unique. And grieving is unique to the individual because of the many possible factors that can shape the experience, and here are just a few examples. Sometimes the factors that make a person's grief harder sometimes easier. At Cruise, we often help people who are struggling with too many difficult factors that complicate their ability to grieve normally. Sorry. These are some of the things. So the relationship, who and what that person meant to the bereaved. Were they intertwined on a daily basis, or did they hardly see each other? Support, the effectiveness and type of support in a person's life. Person can be surrounded by people and still feel unsupported. Culture and faith. A person's culture and faith can shape the grieving experience. On an individual level, sometimes this can be helpful, but it can also be unhelpful. How the person died. This really influences the grief that a person experiences. Was the death sudden, or was it traumatic, or was it peaceful, unexpected? I don't think anyone welcomes the pain and emotional turmoil that we call grief. I think understandably we wish it was straightforward, and we could adjust to life after someone close to us dies. Nice, neat steps that we can work through, or a recipe that we could follow. That isn't how grief works. It's a mess of feelings and emotions, of sadness, relief, anger, frustration, loneliness, and confusion. And you might feel several emotions in the same heartbeat. And we might see that in some of our bereaved fundraisers, supporters, and customers. And there's no magic date when grief is done. And you can get on with your life as before. In truth, I don't think it'll ever be the same. Many people we have supported as a charity in that have talked about learning to live with the space left by their loved one and being able to live with their feelings of grief. I say that grief never totally goes away, but it can bubble up again and even feel as raw, just as it did after their loved one died. If you've been bereaved, you may have experienced some of these symptoms. I don't really like that word, that feels quite clinical, but I couldn't think of a better word for them. And you may see some of these in your donors, your fundraisers, and your customers. Some of these things listed might lead to quite far-reaching consequences for a person. For example, they might struggle at work, so their performance at work might be affected. Their ability to deal with admin tasks, such as closing or updating bank accounts. And some of them, I think, do seem quite shocking within our culture as well. And look at the word hallucinations, for example. But I know that in kind of, for example, I think it's Japanese culture, having a hallucination is actually seen as a real honour, to have seen, the person that has died. So different cultures view these symptoms in very, very different ways. I think that's sometimes useful to bear in mind. Does anyone know who these people are? Dr. John Wilson touched on them and their grief models in his webinar. And for those who find things like this useful or weren't at John's webinar, I thought I'd touch on them again. So in the top left-hand corner, we've got Kubler-Ross, and her model is the stages of grief. And those stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. They were created not as a kind of, you need to go through them and then you're done. I think they're very much about, and this is how I use them, to help understand what grieving people may be going through. Some people experience them all, some people experience a handful, some people don't experience any of them at all. And the 5 ones that I've just mentioned are the main ones, but there are others. I think there's up to 12, I think. The lady at the bottom left in the glasses, that's someone called Lois Tonkin, and she created her models very much about growing around grief. And you might have seen the example of 2 jam jars with a little ball and a big ball. And the idea is that, yeah, our grief doesn't shrink, rather we grow around it. Then we've got the lady in the middle and the gentleman below with glasses. That's strobe and shut. It's a dual process model, the idea that we oscillate. And that's actually very normal. So 1 minute we'll feel okay and another minute we'll feel sad. And sometimes that takes us by surprise, but I think it's a very healthy way of grieving and understanding grief. And then you've got the man on the top right-hand corner, and that's class. And he developed a model called continuing bonds. So the idea of an ongoing inner relationship with the person who has died, which I think is a really beautiful model. So these are some of the kind of more popular grief models in Western culture. I'm mindful that they've all been developed by white people here in the West. And there are other models out there, some really beautiful ones, but it's a real case of searching out the ones that you feel are relevant for the people, for yourself, but also the people that you work with. So these are just some of the comments we hear all the time from bereaved people. In the UK, we're not very good about talking about death, grief, loss, dying, death, or our emotions. So many people really struggle after a death. They don't really know what normal grief is. They may have expectations about how they should feel or behave. And society may also have certain expectation to add to that person's feeling that they aren't doing it right. These are all very common and normal, but clearly could impact a person's life and overall well-being. One of the key things we try to do at Cruise is help people understand that whatever they're experiencing is quite normal following a significant death in bereavement, and that they aren't going mad or losing their mind. Grief is actually a complex mix of emotions that shift and change with time. Just thought I'd very quickly share this with you. It very much sums up what most bereaved people are looking for. And perhaps there are elements here that we can all weave into the work that we do. I won't read it out to you, but I'll give you some time just to read through. As a charity, we often get asked, but what do I say to a bereaved person? What should I not say? And here are some kind of sample phrases, some good and some not so good. So the good are green, the not so good are in red. I think the most important thing is that you say something and don't avoid the topic. We acknowledge the death, and it's about finding words that come naturally to you. And it can be as simple as, I'm sorry to hear your news. I wouldn't offer advice. And I wouldn't assume that you know how they feel, even if you've had a very, very similar experience yourself. I would avoid standard phrases about time being a healer. You may mean well, but they most probably won't feel like that. Bereaved people want to be truly listened to, and taking time to listen and have a compassionate approach is a really, really good start. It's always better to say something than nothing. And if you think you're saying the wrong thing, then just stop. Most bereaved people will understand that you're trying to find something suitable to say. But ultimately, no one can fix this, and that there are no right or magic words. And this brings us on to language. And these are things that bereaved people have said to us. And you'll see that I've kind of bolded and underlined some of the following words, and we'll focus on two just now. So we've got lost and we've got passed away. As a charity, we try and use the words died and death. We might say lost, but we would tend to use died or death first in any piece of writing. We would also avoid using the word passed away. But when speaking directly to someone grieving, we would mirror the language that they use. So if someone writes, "Dear Cruz, I lost my dad last week," we would reply saying, "We're very sorry to hear that you lost your dad." We'd also use the name of the person who died where possible. You'll also see that committed suicide is mentioned too. Before the Suicide Act in 1961, it was a crime to die by suicide. This isn't something we would say. Instead, we would say died by suicide or took their own life. But as you can see, this is all language that people use. And you might have different guidance within the charities you work for, but it's very much about striking that balance between the language that you use as a charity and what's being used by your supporters and what they feel comfortable with, and also your own comfort levels as well. We all have a very different relationship with these words, depending on who we are as people, our stories, and also the places where we work. I believe imagery and bereaved audiences was touched on in a previous webinar, and I can't remember who the charity was, but they found that when they were promoting their Much Love dedication page, graphics worked far better than imagery, and I think there are a few reasons for this. Imagine you're a middle-aged bereaved woman. It's one of our key audiences, and your son or your husband or your brother has just died. And look at this image. It hits home hard, doesn't it? And it evokes a huge amount. I know it does for me, and I know it does for our audience. Now look at this graphic. Doesn't make the grief any easier, but it somehow is less hard-hitting. It evokes fewer feelings. It's okay. Still hard, but it's okay. I was just thinking about the imagery that we use, the reasons why we use it, what we're using it in, and just being very mindful of how we use pictures and graphics, and particularly with bereaved audiences. Next, just going to touch on timings. So I think it's really important that we always acknowledge what has happened. I've heard stories from bereaved people of how people have crossed the road to avoid talking to them because they've just not known what to say. It's understandable if you feel uncomfortable talking about death or other losses, or to worry about that you might say the wrong thing. But staying silent or not contacting somebody after a bereavement can make them feel even more alone and isolated. It can help to reach out to a bereaved person, whether it's a fundraiser, supporter, customer. Then they know you're available to talk and listen if they want. If a supporter or fundraiser is a bereaved whilst you're working with them, a handwritten card just after a bereavement saying you're thinking of them can mean so much. And as grief is as unique as we are as individuals, it's about using your best judgment and not a formula to then communicate with them moving forward. End of the day, we're all human beings. And it's just finding what works for you as a person in your role within the charities that you work in or the organisations you work in. I also wanted to touch on bereaved fundraisers and some of the patterns that we've noticed. From our experience, we find that some people want to fundraise right after a death. I'm literally like within a month. Whilst others only feel comfortable to fundraise much further down the line. For us, it's about 7 years. It's really important to understand that fundraising can be a really, really important part of someone's bereavement and grief journey, and how we work with them makes a huge difference. When we work with bereaved audiences and supporters, we are likely to evoke some difficult and often painful feelings. We would never want to hurt anybody, but we may want to intentionally, very gently evoke people in order for them to connect with our charity and to take action. Most charities do this in some ways, but we need to be especially careful with bereaved people and audiences. And there will always be times when we unintentionally evoke feelings. As I've mentioned several times throughout this webinar, grief is as unique as the person, and sometimes what we say or do won't land with the person, or it lands in the wrong way, and it's okay. These responses can often trigger responses within us. Some may want to rescue and make everything better. Some maybe feel fearful that they've done something wrong and will want to run a mile. Definitely know that was how I used to feel in the past. I think before you respond, just check in with yourself and ensure that you're okay, and then respond sensitively and care. We sometimes call these ruptures, and actually that repair and how we do that repair can make a massive difference and actually really strengthen the relationship. Yeah. For those with clinical teams, sometimes it's worth asking them to check over copy and responses, as they can often provide useful insights and guidance. Something that we have here at Cruise, and I'm eternally grateful for our clinical team. I'm also very grateful that here at Cruise we also have supervision available for staff should we need it. And this can be really useful to explore, offload, and work through some really tricky things. And this might be something that you want to explore for yourself and your team. And for those of us who work a lot with grief, bereavement, and loss, we often find ourselves faced with more sadness than other fundraisers, people within our charity or professions. We're not immune to grief, sadness, or the distress of some of the situations that we come across. But we can often find ourselves devaluing our own concerns when comparing them to the sometimes tragic losses of others. Please do look after yourselves, and thank you so much for being here today. It's been a joy to talk with you all. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. That was absolutely brilliant.